Can you hear me?
Take them. Okay, great. Go.
Good morning. I'm Michael Shifter, President of the Inter-American Dialogue. I'm so pleased to warmly welcome so many good friends and strong supporters to this virtual presidential summit. Since March, all of us have been dealing with the global pandemic. For the dialogue, that has meant pivoting to online events and reinventing many aspects of our work. It has also meant doubling down on our mission to engage global leaders committed to advancing democratic governance, social equity, and prosperity in this hemisphere. Part of the reinvention is this presidential summit. Unfortunately, it was not possible to hold our annual awards gala this year. Our idea was to bring together a group of highly respected former heads of state from across the Americas to discuss the future of US-Latin American relations and reaffirm the dialogue's core conviction since its founding nearly 4 decades ago, that greater hemisphere cooperation is essential to solve common problems. With a new US administration starting next month, and with virtually every country in the Americas struggling to cope with health and economic crises, along with an array of political challenges, the timing of this summit could not be better. And we could not have 4 better former heads of state to engage in a serious conversation about this moment, to be honest and realistic about the problems we face, but also to be creative about possibilities for greater progress when we can summon the will to work together. I am so grateful to former President of Costa Rica, Laura Chinchilla, who is currently a co-chair of the Dialogue's Board of Directors, former President Ricardo Lagos of Chile, the former co-chair of our board, former President Juan Manuel Santos of Colombia, former co-vice chair of the board, and former President Ernesto Zedillo of Mexico, also former co-chair of the Dialogue's board. I want to thank the sponsors of this event, Fundación Vidanta, Pearson, Chevron, Arnold and Porter, Diez Rus, Fundación Mario Lopez, Hills and Company, Jamaica National Group, Rob Lovelace and Alicia Mignana, MetLife, Peter Hakem and Virginia Schofield, SBA Communications, United Health Group, Winston and Strawn, Roche, Mitsubishi, Boeing, McClarty Associates, Merck, Karen Bell, and Jeff Purrier. Let me also express my deep appreciation to the Dialogue's Leadership Committee, our Board of Directors, with a special recognition of Ambassador Tom Shannon, our co-chair, who has agreed to give closing remarks, and our distinguished Chair Emeritus, Ambassador Carla Hills, and also to our President's Leadership Council and Dialogue members. I want to recognize the many ambassadors from Latin America and the Caribbean who are participating, as well as some ambassadors from the United States now serving in the region. Finally, successful reinvention demands resourceful and dedicated staff who have a collective spirit. The Dialogue is very fortunate in that respect. Special thanks to Denise Yanovich for her leadership and to her superb team for their extraordinary efforts to organize this event. I am now very pleased to introduce 2 video messages from former heads of state who were unable to take part in this event. Both are former board co-chairs. First, we will hear from former President of Brazil, Fernando Henrique Cardoso, followed by former President of Chile and now UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet. Following the videos, I will give the floor to Karen DeYoung, a senior national security correspondent and an associate editor of the Washington Post, who has been an active Dialogue member for nearly 3 decades and who has graciously agreed to moderate this conversation. Now we will take a look at the 2 pre-recorded video messages.
Dear Michael, dear friends, dear former presidents of the Americas, we are living in troubling and uncertain times. In many countries, the foundation of democracy are being undermined by a regressive and authoritarian wave. The politics of fear, anger, and resentment weaken the common ground and shared values that hold a nation together. The dissemination of false or misleading information dissolves the frontiers between truth and lies, knowledge and ideology. And yet, as our dear friend Albert Hirschman taught us, we must always have a bias to hope. History is a very inexact science. The unexpected happens, and all of a sudden new opportunities and possibilities emerge. Joe Biden's victory is first and foremost a triumph for democracy. For us Latin Americans, his call for national reconciliation and multilateralism in dealing with global threats is a great relief and encouragement. Authoritarian populism will not disappear overnight, but it is suffered its first major defeat. As a long-time friend and supporter of the dialogue, my message would be the following: let us be bold and seize the moment. Now it's time to rebuild inter-American cooperation on a broader and stronger basis. I believe that the dialogue is well positioned to play a catalytic role in the rebuilding of the bridge between government, the private sector, and international financial agencies to mobilize resources and capacities in the common fight against the pandemic and its social and economic consequences. In Brazil, the private sector is playing a major role in search for a safe and efficient vaccine against coronavirus in partnership with government and the scientific community. In examples like this, and there are many for more throughout the Americas, that I put my hope and my trust for the way forward. I salute the Inter-American Dialogue and wish all of you my best. Thank you very much.
It is my pleasure to join you on this Human Rights Day. My warmest greetings to Tom Shannon, Michael Shifter, and all those participating in today's discussion, including Presidents Chinchilla, Lagos, Santos, and Cedillo. This conversation could not be timelier. We have now a much clearer picture of the impact of COVID-19, including the biggest global recession since World War II and the largest economic contraction in Latin America and the Caribbean in 100 years. Countries, multilateral and regional entities are under pressure to come up with swift and effective measures to mitigate the consequences. And they are significant. According to a joint study by the ILO and ECLAC, 47 million jobs will be lost in 2020, affecting particularly women, young people, and migrants. 2 decades of progress in reducing poverty and inequality are at risk and may bring a new wave of social unrest. But the challenges faced by the Americas predate COVID-19. Inequality, migration, climate change, environmental degradation, organized crime, and weakened rule of law and institutions are but a few. Many countries in the region are in crisis and few solutions have been found. Multilateralism is crucial for these challenges to be overcome. In that regard, I welcome President-elect Biden's intent to revitalize the commitment of the U.S. to human rights, domestically and abroad, including his pledges to work with countries in the Americas on climate change, clean energy, human rights, and combating corruption. I also welcome new and improved strategies to reduce poverty and violence throughout the region, but particularly in Central America. I hope that attention is also centered on some of the human rights crises in the region which garner less attention. Fortunately, some recent developments provide hope for a resurgence in regional consensus and leadership. Last month, at ECLAC's 38th session, foreign ministers and high-level authorities of the Americas signed a declaration reaffirming their commitment to international cooperation, multilateralism, and solidarity in the global response to the pandemic, as well as to the effective implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. This cooperation is at the core of the new social contract that the Secretary General and I have been calling for. As part of these efforts, it is essential that countries support initiatives that ensure the COVID-19 vaccine as a global public good. Other good news for regional cooperation is the forthcoming entry into force of the Escazú Agreement, the first environmental human rights treaty in Latin America and the Caribbean. It is a groundbreaking agreement that not only aims to combat pollution and secure a healthy environment, but also requires states to prevent and sanction attacks against environmental defenders who are at a high risk in the region. These initiatives show the potential for leadership and coordinated action at the inter-American level. Today, we face many uncertainties, yet one thing we know for sure: we must recover better from the pandemic, and for that, we must all work together. This is the focus of this Human Rights Day. I trust you and all leaders throughout the region will work to reinforce multilateral efforts at a time of serious regional and global challenges. Thank you very much.
Good morning and welcome to panelists and guests. I'm Karen DeYoung, National Security Correspondent for the Washington Post, and as Michael said, a longtime Dialogue member. I'm so pleased to be here today to moderate the Dialogue's inaugural presidential summit. As a new administration prepares to take office in the United States and the profound social, economic, and political impacts of the coronavirus pandemic are being felt across the Americas, it's a particularly crucial time to talk about the importance of inter-American relations as we look toward our shared future. We're fortunate to have with us today four of the region's most distinguished former heads of state, influential and distinct voices to help us devise common solutions to the unprecedented challenges we face. So let's get started. I'll introduce our panel and we'll engage in a conversation, and then we'll welcome our guests to the discussion. Laura Chinchilla was elected to a 4-year term as president of Costa Rica in 2010. I'm not going to say she was the first woman president in Costa Rica, because I think she has many other accomplishments. There have been many women presidents in Latin America, and the United States is far behind on this matter. She had a distinguished political career before that, serving as Minister of Public Security, a member of the National Congress, Minister of Justice, and Vice President. Beyond her public career, President Chinchilla has worked with a number of international organizations with particular emphasis on judicial and public security reform and human rights, including for the U.S. Agency for International Development, the United Nations Program for Development, and the Inter-American Development Bank. A political science graduate from the Universidad de Costa Rica, she also holds a master's degree in public policy from Georgetown University in Washington, and is a professor of government at the Technological Institute of Monterrey. Ricardo Lagos is a lawyer with a doctorate in economics who was a key leader in Chile's transition process and return to democracy, and served as Minister of Education and Minister of Public Works before his election as President of the Republic in 2000. His 6 years in office were marked by significant improvements in the country's infrastructure, health and education programs, human rights advancements, including compensation for the victims of human rights violations under the Pinochet dictatorship. After leaving office in 2006, President Lagos founded the Fundación Democracia y Desarrollo and served as UN Special Envoy for Climate Change, as President of the Club of Madrid, and a visiting professor at Brown University. Juan Manuel Santos served as President of Colombia from 2010 to 2018, after serving as Minister for Foreign Trade, of Finance, and as Minister of Defense, where he led the fight against the FARC guerrillas. As president, he was awarded the 2016 Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts negotiating a peace treaty with the FARC. Before he entered politics, President Santos was deputy director of El Tiempo, the most widely circulated daily newspaper in Colombia, and served as president of the Freedom of Expression Commission of the Inter-American Press Association. He holds master's degrees in economic development and public administration. Ernesto Zedillo served as president of Mexico from 1994 to 2000, a period marked by political and electoral reform and poverty reduction. With master's and doctoral degrees in economics, President Zedillo has long been a leading international voice on globalization and its impact on relations between developed and developing nations. President Zedillo is currently director of the Yale Center for the Study of Globalization. He's a member of the Group of 30, an independent group of global leaders using their collective experience and influence for peace, justice, and human rights worldwide. He's chairman of the Rockefeller Foundation Economic Council on Planetary Health, and among a number of other distinguished positions, serves on the Global Commission on Drug Policy and the Kofi Annan Commission on Elections and Democracy in the Digital Age. Welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for being here. President Chinchilla, I'd like to begin with you and a question about what was perhaps the most immediate crisis in the hemisphere. Despite 4 years of effort, the Trump administration and its partners in Latin America were unable to find a solution to what all agreed was the problem of Venezuela, a political and humanitarian disaster that has undermined democracy, produced massive refugee flows, increased narcotics trafficking, and led to a collapsed economy. Is it time for a rethink of how the region as a whole and the new U.S. administration can address this issue overall and the separate problems it has caused for everyone? What's the role that Latin America should play?
Well, thank you, Karen. It's a pleasure to be in this panel. Certainly, as you said, the Maduro's regime persists in Venezuela. But I would like to say that the rigged elections of last Sunday, with a voter turnout of just 20 to 30%, sent a very powerful message of rejection against it. It is clear that for first time, the regime not even managed to rally the support of the Chavistas. Now, the seriousness and magnitude of the political and humanitarian crisis make it necessary to review the strategies that the region and the United States administration have attempted so far to address this problem. My first observation is that the existing bipartisan support in Washington to Guaido's leadership, as well as to the imposition of individual and economic sanctions, have been positive developments that should be maintained, but not for too long, at least economic ones. It is important to understand that sanctions alone will not trigger a democratic transition in Venezuela. The imposition of sanctions must go with a realistic and consistent kind of diplomatic strategy, whose ultimate goal must be the organization of free and fair elections as soon as possible. It is necessary to avoid creating false expectations of the type of all options are on the table, or risky initiatives that Maduro can use in his favor, such as the Operación Gedeón, or improvised plans that won't materialize, like the Insurrección de Testaferros. With this kind of erratic strategies, it is very difficult not only to be successful in changing this situation in Venezuela, but also in gathering a more resolute support of other nations like those of the European Union. So again, it is necessary to articulate the sanctions with an effective and coherent diplomatic strategy. The second point is that the international coalition of more than 60 countries that recognize Juan Guaidó as legitimate interim president must continue supporting him at the National Assembly. But more importantly, their support must go beyond declarations. They must also start showing willingness to adopt sanctions within the framework of a diplomatic effort. My third comment is that it is important to design and implement a strategy to approach those other countries that support Maduro's regime, such as Cuba, Russia, China, and possibly Iran. Precisely because they are part of the problem, they cannot be ignored, as it has happened until now. Finally, let me say some words on the role of Latin American nations. Although the Lima Group has been pivotal in providing a united voice in the Venezuela's crisis, that voice needs to be stronger. efforts should be made to promote a broader intra-regional dialogue that includes nations that have an important weight in the region, such as Argentina and Mexico. In this regard, the future Biden-Harris administration offers an opportunity to rebuild intra-regional dialogue around common concerns, including the situation of Venezuela. This is particularly important given that some of the most relevant regional organizations, such as the OAS and the IDB, have been victims of the polarization that affects the region around the response to the crisis in Venezuela. And let me conclude just by saying that any future strategy on Venezuela must play an emphasis on addressing the humanitarian tragedy as well. Thank you.
Thank you. President Lagos, if I can broaden our scope a little bit, the new U.S. administration will host the Summit of the Americas in 2021, at a time when many other countries in the region, including the United States and Chile, are facing enormous domestic difficulties, from political fragmentation to the ongoing pandemic. Can leaders in the region cooperate constructively on issues such as climate, health, trade, immigration, given such divisions? What are the prospects for regional progress and coordination on these issues?
Well, thank you, and thank you for the invitation to participate in this summit here. Let me tell you that I think that the most important task that all of our countries will have is how to reactivate the economy, given the tremendous crisis that the pandemic has introduced in our countries. And therefore, if we're going to have a reactivation of the economy, it's necessary to have some very huge investment that has to be made in different areas. And there is no question that with regard to climate change and with regard to health, all those investments has to be measured also vis-a-vis how important are going to be the amount that you are going to invest in these particular two areas. And I think that with regard to climate change, there is no question that if you're going to make investment in infrastructure or in some other areas to produce employment, well, till what extent you are going to take into consideration the yardstick is how much influence this will have vis-a-vis climate change. How are you going to be able to reduce emissions? Are you going to be able to increase the capacity of our health system? There is no question that with regard to those two issues, there is more domestic issues rather than international ones. Nevertheless, with regard to the other two questions, I think that is extremely important with regard to the question of trade and migration. Because in the question of trade and migration is going to be so important that all the leaders agree in the region. I think that the election of the United States of Mr. Biden is really a very important step forward because we have to recover the idea of multilateralism is going to be essential to agree with regard to the question of how are we going to put back the role of the World Trade Organization, and more important than that, to what extent that trade is going to be also vis-a-vis some, quote, taxes on imports that when you are exporting goods and services that has a lot of emissions vis-a-vis climate change. The idea of having some tax according to the amount of emissions is being discussed now. This is the place where we are going to discuss the question. There is no question for me. I guess it's very important that in the next meeting, among all the leaders of the Latin American and United States, it has to be a very open discussion on this issue. Till what extent is possible to have recovery and at the same time way to reduce migration. Number two, with regard to the issue of migration, I would like to say the following. This is not only a question of those that are receiving migrants or those that are expelling migrants. I think that it's essential to have a general agreement. How are we going to deal with this issue? Now, in my country, there is no question. We are receiving a lot of migrants, and also some of them are leaving now. Then how are we going to be able to understand that this is an international issue? And here is where I think that the leaders of our countries has to be able to make some very clear definition with regard to the question of migration. This is after Mr. Trump is going to be, I think, a new beginning. And this new beginning means that all the leaders of the hemisphere will have to agree what are the general rules with regard to migration. After all, migration is a human right. Probably the first thing that humans did when we were arriving to this planet was to migrate. Migration has ever existed. How are we going to be able then to have some rules with regard to that? That I think is so important, the new authorities that are going to assume January 20 in the United States. That is going to be a big change in the chances that we have to build a future, all of us together, with this very important issue. Thank you, Madam.
Thank you so much. President Santos, when I began covering Latin America, which was now many decades ago, it was a time of non-democratic governments and grave concerns over human rights. As President Bachelet mentioned, today's Human Rights Day, celebrating the 1948 adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Next year, it will be the 20th anniversary of the signing of the Inter-American Democratic Charter. With few exceptions, every country in the hemisphere currently has a democratically elected government, yet problems persist. What do you see as the current state of human, political, and civil rights in the region, and in what direction are they heading? You have to unmute yourself. There you go. Still muted.
No, parece Santos hablando.
Yeah, he's
You are
good.
fine now.
No, but I
You're
lost. One moment. Am I good? Because I'm not seeing you at all.
You're good.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Lower
Cap.
third when you can.
Very, very nice to see you again after such a long time. As you know, and history has taught us, populism and human rights are like water and oil. They don't like each other. And the populism that we are seeing today, nationalistic populism all around the world and also in Latin America, well, it's a situation which is very bad for human rights. Populists don't like multilateralism, and we've seen also a trend against multilateralism. They don't like institutions, they don't like their courts, either international courts or internal courts. They don't like the checks and balances. They don't like the rule of law. And we are seeing this trend, increasing trend in this type of populism all around the world, and Latin America is not an exception. Now, unfortunately, this is being complemented by another situation that is not good for human rights. And it's that this pandemic has allowed many countries to taste the government by decree, emergency powers. And many governments and many people in power are like baby tigers. Once they eat meat, they don't want to go back to drinking milk. And you're seeing in many countries this trend towards ignoring the checks and balances and accumulating power in the executive. And this has been exacerbated also by this virtual world where Congress when they work virtually is not the same. They lose power vis-a-vis the executive, and that has been also taken advantage of. Now, we can also see that other type of human rights are going to be vulnerated or not guaranteed because of the economic situation. The right to health, the right to education, that's going to be also very, very affected by the economic situation after the pandemic. The countries in Latin America are increasing their debt to astronomical levels, and they don't have the capacity as developed countries to pay that debt. So who's going to pay the consequences, the guarantees of the basic rights of the population? Poverty is going up, as you know, and the health systems are going to be weakened, and the education systems are going to be weakened. So the trend, unfortunately, is not the best one. Now, I do think that the change of government, because the Trump administration, in that respect, gave us a very bad example. They didn't care about human rights. But if the new administration gets involved in this issue with this issue and helps some of the problems that we're having, especially the financial problem, something that the Trump administration did not do, also leads in terms of the green economy and establishes a relationship with Latin America that includes human rights. And I have an idea maybe that for Latin America to do something which is a bit audacious, but I think would be good for today, is included in the basic human rights the right to clean air and to clean water. And there you can start rebuilding a framework of respect for human rights that I hope we can start to rebuild in the region, because what we are seeing, the trend that we are seeing, unfortunately, is not a very positive trend. I leave it there because I think my 4 minutes are finished, but this is my worry.
Thank you. And finally, President Cedillo, this is something that follows on to really all of these questions. As the region struggles to perfect democracy, as the pandemic has impacted economic, social, and political conditions in every country, inequalities that maybe 20 years ago we would have said were beginning to be addressed have now reemerged and are likely to get worse. Is this a wake-up call to tackle the kinds of needs that have been neglected? And what are the risks if they're not addressed? Is it an opportunity to create a new kind of development model? And if so, what would that be? Is it a chance for a new compact between public and private sectors?
Well, I hope it is a wake-up call, but I'm not so sure that those who are supposed to wake up have noticed that yet. Mm-hmm. They should have noticed in the first place that we went into this crisis already in a very bad situation. The 5 years previous to the pandemic were already what we could call, and others have called, a half-lost decade for Latin America. Very low growth and a regression in the progress we had made against poverty and inequality. And of course, the crisis is worsening this to an incredible extent. For one thing, Latin America, shamefully, has become the epicenter of the pandemic. We have much worse indices in morbidity and mortality than the rest of the world. You know, for example, the 6 biggest countries in Latin America, we have 6% of the global population. However, we have more than 18% of the infected people and the dead people because of the pandemic. So we are a public health disaster. On this, unfortunately, we are in a very good company because the US indexes are as bad as Latin America. So America, the continent America, has become the continent of shame because we are the worst in the world as far as the pandemic is concerned. Now, on the economy, we are also in very serious trouble. The global economy, because of the pandemic and the way in which it has been handled, the global economy will contract 4% this year. What happens in Latin America? Latin America's economy will contract more than 8%. And as I said, Nora Lustig has been doing studies of what has happened or what will happen with poverty. And millions of people will fall back into extreme poverty in Latin America, and more millions will fall back into poverty, according to the standard definition. And it's also what has been mentioned. We are seeing a regression in the democratic progress that we have had in previous years. President Santos already mentioned, abuse of power, reduction in the checks and balances, everything that means that our democracy is shrinking, unfortunately, is happening in some of our countries. So I do hope that this is a wake-up call for our societies, but also, very importantly, for our leaders. We cannot go back to business as usual. Are we speaking about a new model? Well, I don't know what model. I don't speak in terms of model because I don't think there is a Latin American model. What I do know is that we need to have more productive and growing economies, and to use the product of that increasing growth of recovery to build new and more powerful social safety nets. But we will not be able to do that unless we do have also rule of law in our countries, because with notable exceptions, rule of law is not the rule in Latin America. So I think the idea of a new social contract that some of us have been speaking about or entertaining is very important, because in order to build stronger social safety nets, in order to have more productive and growing economies, we will have to incur in additional effort and sacrifices, and societies will not be willing to do that unless we put on the table a totally different social contract. So it is not about a new model, it's about a social contract that, by the way, probably not in our history we have had in Latin America.
Thank you. I want to follow up on all of those issues by asking all of you how useful the current inter-American system is in dealing with and managing these kinds of problems, particularly the OAS, which seems at the moment starved for both resources and relevance. Are there new institutions that need to be created around rule of law, around democracy, around trade, which also seems to be very fragmented at the moment? Whichever of you feels like there's something important to say. President Santos.
Yes, the first Secretary General of the OAS was a Colombian. His name was Alberto Lleras. And he said, in a way answering your question, that institutions and international organizations were what the member countries wanted them to be. And unfortunately, right now, the OAS, for example, is not working because the leaders of the countries that are part of this organization are exercise no leadership, and they have been unable to agree on any basic vision or objective for this institution in today's world. It's very sad to say, and I'm sad that it's the reality, but the OAS right now is not addressing the problems it should address in the countries because there is no leadership in Latin America. We need to try to create that a new type of leadership that would allow these institutions to reinvigorate themselves in order to be able to fulfill their basic objectives. If we don't do that, these organizations will continue to be somewhat irrelevant. And one of the organizations that was performing or should perform a vital role right now, the IDB, well, it was taken over by the Americans or by an American, in contrast to what the rest of the region, Latin America, wants, and therefore you're going to have problems there also of where is this institution going and what role is going to play, unfortunately.
Anyone else? President Lagos, would you like to weigh in on that question? I think you're muted. You need to unmute. There you go.
Can you repeat my question?
I just the question of how relevant and useful the current Inter-American system is, the institutions of the Inter-American system. Are they useful? If not, can they be reformed to become useful in addressing the problems that all of you have outlined? Are there new institutions that need to be created?
Well, it seemed to me that probably the time has come to have a review of what do we have in the Inter-American system. And probably this means also some kind of rearrangement vis-a-vis the Organization of American States. Because it seemed to me that we should have something to discuss among ourselves. And I think that the relationship should be at the Inter-American level, understanding the role that has to be played by the United States, and probably a meeting by the presidents every 2 years, every 3 years, or whatever it is necessary. And at the same time, to understand that the General Board, the members of the Council in Washington, probably has to make some revision of that. In other words, where are we going to discuss the real issues? I remember at the time of the Iraq War, I had to be on the phone talking with every president because every president wanted to say something to me as the representative of Latin America in the Security Council. Well, if it is possible to have something like the Atlantic Alliance vis-a-vis, I'm not talking about the military issues, but I'm talking about that kind of an understanding in the Atlantic Alliance between Europe and the United States. And I think that may be extremely more important rather than to have a very old Inter-American system. And probably the time has come to rethink about that vis-a-vis what is the big changes that are taking place all over in many other areas. And I think that the time has come to rethink a bit, to rethink what kind of institution we need in order to have a more normal understanding between Latin American and the Caribbean countries and United States. And here, of course, the role of Canada is extremely important. That would be my answer in a question that is much more deep of what do we have, because the architecture probably is a little bit old, and some refreshing in the architecture may be on time. Thank you.
I want to ask President Chinchilla and Zedillo in particular about these, but anyone should weigh in. You both came to office during times of economic crisis in your own countries and made significant progress getting out of it. How similar is the current crisis to what you and others experienced, and how useful are the remedies of the past to getting out of the current predicament, assuming that the pandemic will sort of fade away to some extent this year? And perhaps, President Zedillo, you could talk about South America, and President Chinchilla about Central America as somewhat distinct entities facing these kinds of problems.
Well, the Mexican crisis of 94, 95 was different from the one we are going through. Michel Camdessus, the managing director of the IMF, defined the Mexican crisis of 94, 95 as the first crisis in emerging markets of the 21st century. And by that, he meant to say that we have dealt with something we didn't know about before, and that is the sudden reversal of short-term financial capital flows by many, many participants in the market, attacking or affecting an emerging country, like the case in Mexico. And that took Mexico with a very weak banking system and a number of other domestic conditions that made us at the time very vulnerable. I think if there is any lesson to be learned from that crisis and how to address the present crisis, is that you have to be decisive. You have to put at front all the effort to confront the crisis. And you have to do it with no regard for political popularity for the president who is in charge of dealing with the crisis. And I think that's an element that I would hope, and I would have hope, that would prevail in this crisis. What I have seen, and we commented this some months ago, President Santos, President Lagos, with great concern, is that some of our leaders think that the methods that they use to win democratically power are methods that they can continue to use in this very difficult situation. And that is not true. The result is going to be a disaster. And unfortunately, we were right, because now we have the disaster in front of our eyes. You know, thousands, hundreds of thousands of people dead in Latin America because of the pandemic, and our economies in a very difficult situation. So I would say that's the lesson, you know. Don't fool around with political popularity. Do what it needs to be done to overcome a major disaster. This is not about ideology. This is about protecting the people and getting the way to have the economy recover rather soon and have an economy that produces for the people. And I think that lesson is not being applied.
President Chinchilla?
Yes, Karen, I will add that different from, for example, the debt crisis of the 80s, and even the war in Central America. Let's remember that Central America was one of the last battlegrounds of the Cold War. At that time, people had a hope, and that was the hope of new democratic systems. Now, when you analyze the figures, people all around Latin America are feeling disenfranchised from democracy. So I think that politics has a very important role to play, not only because most of the decisions are coming from the governments, but also because in certain way, the different sectors are looking at the politicians to see how they are behaving. When you have the kind of crisis that you can see in Peru and many other countries, when there are contradictions between the governments with the parliaments, when some governments are trying to silence the voice of the judiciary, when instead of investing the resources with integrity, you can find corruption in spending the money. So that means that we are really risking not only our economic growth, not only the social indicators, but also we are risking our democracies. So I think that we have to be very serious. Now, let me say some words on Central America. We praise Biden's initiative on the region. Usually when we speak about the biggest problem that our hemisphere has, we think about Venezuela, and we are doing well because Venezuela is something really serious. But the second hot spot that we have in the region is Central America. So I think that is a very good idea to invest in Central America. He is offering $4 billion. But I will just warn about three aspects. First, the region is much worse than the region he left. So I am afraid that we will need even more financial resources and more effort. Secondly, there are high expectations for immediate and positive change in immigration policies with a more humane kind of approach, but they will need to be very cautious about how they are going to implement it, because otherwise it is going to create a huge and massive flow of migrants to the United States. And finally, let me say some words about the organized crimes and narcotics and the drug cartels, because I'm afraid that we will continue working as business as usual. And we have to think about something different and trying to recognize that when the United States is legalizing the cannabis, we cannot pretend to continue with the same federal policies for the rest of the region. So that is something that we should, in certain way, discuss and debate and try to look for a regional solution to the problem.
We have about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to invite anyone, any of the listeners who want to submit a question through the Q&A feature of Zoom. One of the questions that we've gotten is about China and navigating countries in the region, navigating between the United States and China. And I'd like to lead into that by just talking a bit about President-elect Biden and U.S. relations with the region as we emerge from what you all have indicated has been the somewhat unusual presidency of the last 4 years. Jake Sullivan, who's going to be President-elect Biden's national security advisor, wrote an article a couple of years ago noting that what he described as the passing of U.S. dominance does not need to be the end of U.S. leadership. He said the United States may not be able to direct outcomes, but it can still mobilize cooperation on shared challenges and shape consensus on key roles. Although Washington will not be the only future destination for countries seeking capital, resources, or influence, it will remain the most important agenda setter. Is the United States still the most important agenda setter for the region? And how do the countries of Latin America navigate in these times of crisis and real need between the United States and China, with the competition, certainly, that the current administration has set up? Who would like to address that? President Zedillo? You have to unmute. And then President Santos. You both have to unmute. There you go.
Thank you, Karen. Well, I think the first business of order is to put some order into the U.S.-China relationship. I think what has happened over the last few years is bad for the U.S., is bad for China, and is bad for the world, including certainly Latin America. I think the trade war that the Trump administration declared and executed and was corresponded by China has been negative for the U.S. It hasn't fixed any of the problems that were used as an argument to declare that war. And I think, or I hope, that this anti-China inertia that we have seen in the last few years is put in a more rational perspective That, of course, has to be in a way that the interests of the United States is first and foremost looked after, because that's a mission of the president and the government of the United States, to look after the interests of the American people. You know, to repeat that and use that as a political lemma is almost an insult to intelligence. Of course, presidents are first and foremost to look after their own countries. So use that as a demagogic statement is regrettable. But I think now we have the facts to say very clearly the Trump administration was totally wrong on their trade policies, including the China question. So if that is fixed, I hope, then I think it will be easier for we Latin Americans to navigate these waters that anyways will be turbulent. And I hope that is also the case for Mexico. You know, Mexico is a kind of a special case. We just renegotiated NAFTA, my country, with the US and Canada. That was the initiative of the US. And let me say it very clearly. Relative to having no NAFTA, the new agreement is better. But the new agreement relative to NAFTA is clearly inferior for Mexico. You know, and one of the reasons is inferior because there is a provision in that new agreement that says if we want to have a trade agreement with China, we need to have the agreement of the United States. This has no precedent in the more than 30 free trade agreements that Mexico had negotiated over the years. I was never asked to be asking for permission to President Clinton to negotiate a free trade agreement with Europe. I never got a call from Washington to say, to ask for that permission. And now we have an agreement that if we want to have more open trade with China, we will have to ask for permission from the part of the United States. So this is just an example of how complicated and important for us is to have a new normal, relationship between U.S. and China, of course, with new understandings, enforceable understandings to address the issues that legitimately are of concern for the United States.
President Santos, Colombia has obviously a robust trading relationship with China. Is the United States still setting the agenda, and how do you navigate those sometimes conflicting demands?
Well, there's a simple fact. If the U.S. ignores Latin America, especially in the near future, when Latin America has so many needs, well, the vacuum will be filled by China. This is a fact. Now, the U.S. has a tremendous opportunity with this new administration. First, the new president, Joe Biden, knows the region very well. As vice president, I think he visited 18 times Latin America. The top people in his administration know Colombia very well. The Secretary of State, Blinken, John Kerry, all of them know Latin America very well. So this is an advantage. And there are some issues that we are going to need urgently. First, as has been mentioned, and Ernesto Cedillo knows this very well, is the financial issue. What we're going to need in the next years in financing that the old administration blocked, for example, the G20, the special drawing rights for Latin America, for emerging countries, that was blocked by the Trump administration. Now, the U.S. can play a very important role changing that issue and helping Latin America in that respect. And the other very important issue that I think for Latin America, in order to also get more space in the world arena, is the environment. And there, the green economy and all that is happening around the green economy, the United States can take a tremendous leadership and bring along Latin America in that respect. So I think there are great opportunities to increase this relationship, U.S. Latin America. But if we are continued to be ignored, as in a way we were ignored in the last years, China will definitely fill this vacuum.
We have unbelievably run out of time. It's such an interesting discussion, and it's only now that more questions are starting to flow in. And I'm sorry, hopefully some of them can be addressed in the breakout rooms. I want to thank all of our participants. And last but certainly not least, I want to turn the floor over to a man who needs no introduction for most of us, and that's Dialogue co-chair Tom Shannon. Ambassador Shannon spent over 30 years in the U.S. Foreign Service, most recently as Secretary of State for Political Affairs in the State Department from 2016 to 2018. He was counselor and senior advisor to the Secretary, 4 years ambassador to Brazil, Assistant Secretary of State for Western Hemisphere Affairs, and Special Assistant and Senior Director for Western Hemisphere at the National Security Council. So, Tom, without further ado, over to you, and thank you all very much.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. It's been a wonderful, wonderful discussion today. We're very grateful to you for moderating this discussion, and especially grateful for the presidents who participated today, for the two who participated by video, Presidents Cardozo and Bachelet, but those four who participated in real time, President Chinchilla, President Lagos, President Santos, and President Zedillo. This has been a remarkably rich discussion, and in fact, for me at least, it's produced a certain amount of nostalgia because it's reminded me of what inter-American dialogue was like with this kind of leadership. Great national leaders, but great regional voices, and great promoters and supporters of the democracy, the markets, the open society that have defined the Americas and have made the Americas such an important part of a globalizing world. And I want to thank all of those who participated today in this conversation. I hope you found this as worthwhile as I did. And as we prepare to go to the breakout rooms, I just want to underscore a few important points. First, what for me is evident from this discussion is that in the Americas, in North America, in Central America, in South America, and in the Caribbean, we have a way of understanding politics that is not about the status quo. It's about using democracy to drive social and economic change and development. And I think the leaders today highlighted that in the way they talked about the challenges we face because of the pandemic, because of the economic and social consequences of it, but also because of the very particular problems that we face in the short term, whether it be Venezuela or Central America or issues of migration. And I was especially taken by President Zedillo, who called for political courage, who underscored that getting elected and governing are two very different things, and that in a region that has been fractured and fragmented by the pandemic, we have an opportunity to bring ourselves together, and we're going to have the platforms to which to do it in the short term, especially with the Summit of the Americas. And the idea that President Lagos talked about of refreshing the inter-American architecture and finding new ways to focus on how we build our dialogue and how we build a larger agenda in the region. And then what President Santos and President Chinchilla were able to talk about in terms of dealing with specific problems, focusing on human rights, but especially the importance of addressing the social concerns of the region are hugely important. So I think this has created a rich space for us to have our breakout sessions. And again, Karen, I just want to conclude by thanking you for the wonderful way in which you've conducted this conversation.